Just before dawn on December 21st, 1944, a 19-year-old automatic rifleman named Francis Curry was standing guard at a bridge on the edge of a small Belgian town called Malmedy, listening to German artillery walk toward him through the dark. He had learned, in 3 months of combat, to read a barrage the way a farmer reads weather. This one had a purpose. Shells did not fall this thickly on a quiet bridge unless something heavy was meant to follow them across it. When the smoke began to thin, he looked down the road and saw what the shelling had been hiding. The long barrel of a tank gun was sliding around the corner of a building, and above it, framed against the gray light, a German tank commander stood upright in his turret, calmly surveying the ground he intended to take. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Here's the thing that every manual, every instinct, and every reasonable calculation would have told that young man in the next several seconds. He was one rifleman. The thing coming up the road was a tank, and behind it were more tanks, and behind the tanks were infantry. The American anti-tank guns that were supposed to stop exactly this had already been overrun. The sensible response, the survivable response, the response that no court and no conscience would ever have faulted, was to put down the rifle and raise both hands. Surrender was not cowardice. Surrender was arithmetic, except that in this particular corner of Belgium, in this particular week, the arithmetic of surrender had been rewritten in a way that Francis Curry understood perfectly. To grasp why a teenager chose to fight a column of armor with a rifle he could barely have hoped to hurt it with, you have to understand 3 things that had happened in the 120 hours before he looked up and saw that turret. You have to understand who he was. You have to understand what had been done to American prisoners 4 days earlier, a few miles from where he was standing. And you have to understand that the enemy grinding toward him that morning was, quite literally, not what it appeared to be. This is the story of what one young man did with a minute in which surrender was a smart choice, and of the very strange way his country chose to remember him for it. Start with the young man, because almost nothing about him suggested what was coming. Francis Sherman Curry was born in the summer of 1925 in Loch Sheldrake, New York, a speck of a place in the Catskill Mountains. By the time he was 12 years old, both of his parents were gone, and he became a ward of the New York state system. A boy passed from a children's home into foster care. He grew up on a farm near the village of Hullyville with a foster family, finished high school, and did the thing a great many fatherless boys of his generation did when they reached the edge of adulthood in a country at war. He enlisted. He was 17 years old. The Army looked at the young man and saw potential, at least at first. He was sent to officer candidate school, and he completed it at the age of 18. And then the Army looked again and decided that he was, in the judgment of superiors, too immature to be made an officer. They denied him his commission. It is one of the small, quiet ironies that sit underneath this entire story, and it is worth holding on to. The institution that would one day hand him the nation's highest award for battlefield leadership had first concluded that he was not steady enough to lead a platoon in peacetime. There was another delay, and it came from the very top. A wartime policy meant that the youngest soldiers were not to be fed into frontline combat the moment they finished training. Curry trained with the 75th Infantry Division and was eventually slated for England, but the order that would carry him toward the fighting was held back until after his 19th birthday. So he arrived at the war later than he might have, and he arrived thoroughly prepared. During his stateside training, he had been taught the full toolbox of the American infantryman. He could handle the M1 Garand rifle. He could run a Browning 30 caliber machine gun and a 50 caliber machine gun. He was expert with the Browning automatic rifle, the heavy, punishing squad weapon the men simply called a bar. And he had been trained on the bazooka, the shoulder-fired tube that launched a rocket a little over 2 1/3 inches across, the one weapon a foot soldier carried that could actually kill a tank. In September of 1944, he joined the 30th Infantry Division as a replacement, slotting into a veteran outfit, then holding the line in Holland. He was a teenager who had been told he could not lead, dropped into a division that had been fighting since Normandy. A few weeks later, all of that training would be tested at once, in the space of a single morning. Now widen the lens, because the morning at the bridge did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of the largest and bloodiest battle the United States Army would fight in the entire war. On December 16, 1944, in the pre-dawn cold, some 2,000 German guns opened fire along a quiet, thinly held stretch of the Ardennes forest, and Adolf Hitler launched a gamble that the Germans codenamed Watch on the Rhine, and that the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. German armor would punch through the weakly defended Ardennes, race across the Meuse River, and seize the great Belgian port of Antwerp, splitting the American and British armies, and Hitler hoped, shocking the Western Allies into a separate peace. Everything depended on speed. The spearheads had to move fast, capture bridges and fuel before the Americans could react, and keep the roads open behind them. Any town that sat astride those roads, any crossroads that could choke the advance, became suddenly enormously valuable. Malmedy was one of those places. It sat on the road network that the German 6th Panzer Army needed, and it was held, as it happened, by Curry's outfit, the 30th Infantry Division. The 30th was not a famous division in the way some others were, but it was profoundly respected, and not only by its own side. The Germans had fought the 30th repeatedly from Normandy to the German border, and they had come to refer to it with a grim sort of compliment as Roosevelt's SS. These were men who knew their trade. In the days after the offensive began, the 30th was rushed south into the Ardennes to plug the line, and the 120th Infantry Regiment, Curry's regiment, took up the defense of Malmedy and its approaches. They were dug in, supported by tank destroyers and anti-tank guns and combat engineers, and they were waiting, because everyone understood that the Germans would have to come to town. And then there's the second thing you have to understand, the one that turned the abstract arithmetic of surrender into something much darker for every American in that sector. On December 17, 1944, the day after the offensive opened, a column of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the spearhead unit led by a hard, ambitious officer named Joachim Paper, overran a small American convoy at a crossroads called Bognes, just southeast of Malmedy. The Americans, mostly men of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, were lightly armed support troops with no chance against tanks. They surrendered, as the rules of war entitled them to do. They were herded into a snow-covered field, and then the SS troops opened fire on them with machine guns and pistols. 84 American prisoners were murdered in that field. Some who survived the first volley by feigning death were sought out and shot in the head. A handful escaped into the woods, and the news of what had happened at the Bognes crossroads moved through the American lines faster than any official report ever could. Think about what that meant for a man like Curry, holding a bridge a few miles away just 4 days later. The single most basic assumption of combat, the assumption that allows a soldier to ever lay down his weapon, is that surrender buys survival. That assumption had just been shot to pieces in a Belgian pasture. Every American along that front, now, carried a piece of brutal new knowledge. In this sector, against this enemy, in these days, raising your hands might not save your life. It might simply be the last thing you ever did. The choice the title of this story poses, the choice between surrender and resistance, was for these men not really a choice at all. The men who had chosen the reasonable option at Bognes were lying frozen in a field. Surrender had been turned into a trap, and the Germans themselves had set it. Now the third thing, and it is the strangest, because it sharpens the whole story into something close to a riddle. The German force that came from Malmedy on the morning of December 21st was not what it claimed to be. As part of the offensive, Hitler had approved a special operation with the code name Greif, and he had handed it to the most celebrated commando in the German military, an Austrian SS officer named Otto Skorzeny, the man who had snatched the deposed Italian dictator Mussolini off a mountaintop the year before. Skorzeny's mission had two halves. The first was a small force of English-speaking German soldiers, dressed in captured American uniforms and riding in captured American jeeps, carrying forged American papers, sent slipping through the lines to spread confusion, switch road signs, cut wires, and generally poison the American rear with doubt. They succeeded in one respect that they had never really intended. The rumor spread that these infiltrators meant to assassinate the Allied Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, and for days afterward nervous sentries across the front demanded that everyone, up to and including generals, prove their identity with trivia about baseball and movie stars. The American army began in a small way to distrust its own face. The second half of Operation Greif was heavier metal. Skorzeny had assembled an armored unit, the 150th Panzer Brigade, and because he could not get enough genuine American vehicles, his men had taken German tanks and assault guns and disguised them. They took the Panther, one of the best tanks of the war, with its distinctive long gun and sloped armor, and they welded on sheet metal and reshaped its silhouette and painted American stars on it, trying to make it resemble an American M10 tank destroyer. The fakes were not perfect. Up close, the suspension and the proportions gave them away. But in the smoke and confusion of a dawn attack, at a distance, through tired eyes, a German Panther might be mistaken for an American friend just long enough to matter. Roughly 5 of these counterfeit tank destroyers, supported by a handful of genuine German assault guns, were committed to the attack on Malmedy. The enemy was coming to take the town wearing the skin of the men who held it. By the time Skorzeny's brigade actually attacked, however, the deception had already begun to unravel, and the larger gamble of Operation Greif was failing. The primary mission, to seize bridges over Meuse, had become impossible as a whole German timetable slipped. Skorzeny's armor had spent the previous day assembling near the village of Ligneville, a few miles south of Malmedy, snarled in the colossal traffic jams that were strangling the entire offensive on the narrow Ardennes roads. Not all of his battle groups even arrived in time, and the Americans in Malmedy were no longer the thin screen of engineers that Skorzeny's scouts had reported days earlier. The town had been heavily reinforced. The 120th Infantry was there in strength, along with armored infantry, a tank battalion, tank destroyers, and a battalion that included a number of Norwegian-American soldiers. The defenders were dug in, alert, and, after Bognez, in absolutely no mood to be generous. The attack came in the early hours of December 21st. The disguised Panthers rolled forward to the fields and meadows on the edge of Malmedy, and almost immediately the careful deception ran into something brutally simple. The Americans had strung trip, wires across the approaches, rigged the signal flares. As the heavy vehicles came on, they snagged the wires, and flares hissed up into the dark, throwing hard white light across the snow and exposing the shapes of the tanks for exactly what they were. The painted stars did not matter much in that light. What mattered was that armor was coming, and the men of the 30th Division began to fight for the town. American tank destroyers and infantry opened fire. The defenders called for artillery, and the big shells began to come down. Somewhere in that opening chaos, on the approaches near a bridge, a 19-year-old replacement was about to discover what all of his training had actually been for. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This is the moment we began with. The barrage lifting, the smoke thinning, the long gun barrel sliding around the corner, the tank commander standing tall in his hatch, master of everything he could see. Curry was an automatic rifleman. The weapon in his hands was a bar, a fine and powerful gun against men, and very nearly useless against the frontal armor of a tank. He was part of a small knot of soldiers holding a strong point and a bridge that the German armor had to cross, and the situation around them was already coming apart. The anti-tank guns that were supposed to anchor this position had been overrun in the first rush. Men were falling back. Within a short and violent span of time, Curry and a handful of others, the oldest of them barely past 21, would find themselves cut off, a tiny island of resistance with German tanks to their front and German infantry working around their flanks. By every measure that mattered on a battlefield, they were surrounded, outgunned, and finished. The enemy in front of them expected, quite reasonably, that the defenders of that bridge were about to break and run, or break and surrender. What the enemy did not know was that the young man watching that tank commander through the smoke had been trained on every weapon an infantryman could carry, that he had 4 days of terrible knowledge about what surrender meant in this place, and that he had already begun, without drama and without hesitation, to do the math a different way. The German tank commander never had the chance to enjoy his commanding view. Curry raised his weapon, settled the sights on the man standing exposed in the turret, and fired a burst. The weapon in his hands was a Browning automatic rifle, the heavy, hard-kicking gun the men simply called a bar, and being its operator was a specific and dangerous job. An automatic rifleman carried more firepower than the riflemen around him, which meant he drew more attention, fired more often, and ran dry faster, lugging a weapon that weighed the better part of 20 pounds before you added the loaded magazines. It was a magnificent weapon against men. It was nearly useless against a tank. Curry's burst could kill the commander in the open hatch, and it bought a few precious seconds. But it did nothing to the machine itself. The tank kept coming, grinding down the road toward the bridge, as indifferent to rifle fire as a closed door is to a knock. And so Curry did the only sensible thing a man with the wrong weapon can do. He went looking for the right one. He pulled back, crossing toward a nearby building, and inside it he found what the retreating Americans had left behind, a bazooka. It is worth pausing on exactly what that weapon was and was not, because the whole drama of the next several minutes turns on it. The bazooka was a thin steel tube, fired from the shoulder, that launched a small rocket a little over 2 1/3 inches across. The rocket carried what engineers call a shaped charge, a cone of explosive designed to focus its entire force into a single narrow jet capable of burning through steel. It was the one weapon in an infantryman's hands that could, in theory, kill a tank. But against the newest and heaviest German armor, it was a weapon of desperation more than confidence. The thick, steeply sloped frontal plate of a German Panther could shrug off a bazooka rocket entirely, sending it skidding off into the snow. To do real damage, a man had to hit the places where the armor was thin or the design was vulnerable, the tracks, the flanks, the rear deck, or the narrow seam where the turret sits on the hull. And to get a hit like that, he had to be close, often within a few tens of yards, close enough that the weapon's vicious backblast announced its position to every enemy nearby, close enough that missing meant dying. The bazooka did not make a foot soldier the equal of a tank. It simply gave him a chance, if he was willing to stand still long enough to take it. There was also the small matter that a bazooka without rockets is just a length of pipe, and the rounds were not where the launcher was. They were across the way, out in the open, in a wrecked half-track and a knocked-out anti-tank position that sat squarely under German observation and German fire. To arm the weapon, Curry would have to leave cover and cross ground that the enemy was actively sweeping with everything it had. He crossed through small arms fire and machine gun fire and the falling artillery in the brutal cold of an Ardennes December, where the snow was deep and the ground was frozen iron hard, and a man's hands went numb on the metal of his weapons. He gathered rockets, and he came back. Then he and another soldier set up a bazooka and waited for the tank. When it came on again, they fired. The rocket struck the tank low, at the base of the turret, in exactly the kind of vulnerable seam that a bazooka could actually exploit, and it jammed the turret solid. A tank that cannot turn its gun is a tank that has been blinded and disarmed in the same instant. The machine that a moment earlier had been advancing with all the confidence of a commander who once stood in its hatch now stopped, helpless, and then reversed, backing away in the direction it had come from. One rocket, one shot. The title of this story speaks of 60 seconds, and that is not a bad measure it. Because on a battlefield, the difference between a man who acts and a man who freezes is counted in seconds, and in the seconds after that turret swung into view, a 19-year-old had found a weapon, armed and under fire, and turned the lead tank in attack into a stalled and useless hulk. The enemy that had expected the bridge to fall found its spearhead suddenly broken on a rifleman it had not bothered to take seriously. It was not over. It was barely beginning. Minutes later, 3 more German tanks rounded the same corner and headed for bridge, and Curry, now more or less alone at the decisive point, went back to the well. He ran once more to a knocked-out anti-tank position and a nearby vehicle, and this time he came away with an armful of anti-tank grenades, the rifle-launched kind that a determined man could throw at the running gear and flanks of armor. He fired them at the 3 tanks, one after another, by himself, working the weapon and the angles with the cold competence of someone who had been taught every tool in the kit and was now using them all in sequence. He could not destroy 3 tanks with grenades the way a gun crew might, but he did something just as decisive. He made it intolerable to stay buttoned up inside them under his relentless fire. The crews abandoned their vehicles and scrambled for cover, and the armored thrust that was supposed to roll across the bridge and into Malmedy lost his nerve and his momentum at the hands of a single man with a satchel of grenades. The fight then turned, as so many of these fights did, into a close and ugly contest for buildings. A short distance away stood a house that the Germans had occupied and turned into a strong point, its windows spitting fire across the open ground. Curry spotted 3 German soldiers in its doorway and cut all 3 down with his bar. Then, judging that the house itself had to be silenced, he did something that reads on the page like recklessness and was in fact a cold, tactical decision. He took up the bazooka again, left cover, and advanced alone to within about 50 yards of the enemy-held house, out in the open, in full view of men who were trying very hard to kill him, covered by what friendly fire his comrades had given him. He stood upright, sighted on the building, and fired. The rocket brought down half of one wall in a roar of dust and broken masonry, and the Germans inside who survived it came spilling out into the open. And it was from that exposed forward position that Curry saw the thing that turned the rest of his morning from a defense into a rescue. 5 American soldiers were pinned down nearby, cut off and helpless, held in place for hours by fire coming from that same house, and from 3 more German tanks parked in support. They could not move. The moment any of them rose, the guns found them. Curry understood the geometry of it instantly. The 5 men could not escape until the tanks and the guns covering them were dealt with, and there was no one else to deal with them. So he went back across the deadly ground one more time, to a vehicle where he found another armful of anti-tank grenades, and he launched them under heavy fire at the supporting tanks until their crews, like the others before them, were driven out of their vehicles and forced to take shelter in the house. Then he climbed up onto a half-track, in full and deliberate view of the Germans, and turned a mounted machine gun on the building, hammering it to keep every head down. When he had to shift position yet again, he came upon a machine gun whose entire crew had been killed, sitting silent in the chaos. He got behind it and opened fire, and under the cover of that gun, the 5 trapped Americans were finally able to break from their position and fall back to safety. Every one of them lived because a teenager kept finding one more weapon and one more reason not to stop. By the time it was over, the German attack on that stretch of the line had failed completely. As the official account would later put it with bureaucratic understatement, the enemy, deprived of its tanks and with heavy losses among its infantry, was forced to withdraw. The bridge held, Malmedy held, and when night finally came, Curry and the remnants of his group, including 2 wounded men, made their own way back to American lines. They came across an army jeep fitted with mounts or stretchers, loaded their wounded onto it, and Curry, still carrying the bar he had started the day with, perched himself on the jeep's spare tire and rode shotgun out of the battle he had very nearly fought single-handed. Step back from the bridge now and look at the larger morning, because the title promised a burning tank, and the burning tanks of Malmedy are real, and their story is its own piece of bitter irony. Scoresny's grand deception, the Panthers dressed up as American tank destroyers, accomplished almost nothing. The trip wires and the flares had stripped away the disguise in the first minutes. American gunners and artillery tore into the attack. The assault failed all along the line, and when the Germans pulled back, they left their counterfeit tank destroyers behind on the field. Several of the disguised Panthers were abandoned, and 3 of them were finished off by their own crews, blown apart with demolition charges, so that the Americans could not capture them intact and study the trick. So yes, German tanks burned at Malmedy that day, but the ones that burned most thoroughly were set alight by German hands. The elaborate American costumes consumed along with the machines underneath them. An operation built entirely on pretending to be something, it was not ended with its centerpiece weapons destroyed by the very men who had built the lie. Scoresny himself was wounded in the face by artillery shrapnel that evening as he made his way back toward his headquarters near Lignaville. His brigade had lost around 150 men. It tried once more east of the town the following day, and the 120th Infantry threw it back again. After that, the attacks on Malmedy stopped. The town would suffer one more cruelty, when American bombers, in the appalling confusion of those days, mistook it for a German-held target and bombed it by error in the days that followed, killing soldiers and civilians both. In a battle so saturated with disguise and misidentification, even the men in the sky could not always tell friend from enemy. There is a deeper and darker symmetry to those days, and it belongs to the men who had committed the massacre at the Bognez crossroads. The same spearhead that murdered the prisoners, the battle group led by Joachim Paper, was at that very moment being run into ground only a few miles to the west, and the division doing much of the running was Curry's own. Paper had entered the Ardennes at the head of a powerful armored column, roughly 4,800 men, and well over 100 tanks, among them 45 of the enormous King Tiger tanks, machines so heavy that the narrow Belgian roads and small stone bridges could barely bear them. He had counted on speed and surprise, and he had been promised fuel that never adequately came. Instead, he ran into blown bridges and stubborn roadblocks, and again, the soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division, the outfit the Germans grimly called Roosevelt's SS, at villages with names like Stavelot and Stillmont and La Glees, the men of the 30th, alongside the 82nd Airborne and the 3rd Armored, closed in from the north and east and west and tightened a noose around the spearhead that was supposed to win the war. By a few days before Christmas, the most feared armored column in the German offensive was trapped in a tiny perimeter on a Belgian hilltop, surrounded, almost completely out of fuel, low on ammunition, and reduced to a fraction of its strength. The great King Tigers, all but unkillable in a straight fight, were useless without gasoline. They had become, in the end, nothing but heavy steel anchors. And so on Christmas Eve, Paper gave the order that marked the absolute collapse of Hitler's gamble on the northern shoulder. He told his surviving men to destroy or abandon every vehicle they could not move and to escape on foot, slipping out to the American lines in the dark. The men who could walk walked. The wounded were left behind with a small rear guard. Paper had entered the Ardennes with roughly 4,800 men. Fewer than 800 walked back out. He left his tanks where they sat, and one of those abandoned King Tigers still rests today outside a small museum in the village of La Glees, a silent monument to a column that murdered prisoners on a Wednesday and was destroyed by the following weekend. The arithmetic of that week is its own kind of verdict. The men who decided that surrendered Americans did not deserve to live were, within days, fleeing on foot through the snow, leaving behind the very machines that were supposed to make them invincible. The Bulge itself ground on for another month, and it cost both sides terribly. Hitler's gamble had never been realistic, and it shattered against the road network, the weather, the fuel shortages, and the stubbornness of men like the ones who held Malmedy and trapped Paper. The German spearheads never reached the Meuse in strength, let alone Antwerp. By late January of 1945, the Belgian line had been pressed flat. The offensive was a ruin, and Germany had spent the last of the armored reserves it needed to defend its own borders. The cost was staggering on both sides. Tens of thousands of Germans were killed, wounded, or captured, and irreplaceable tanks and aircraft thrown into the Ardennes were simply gone. On the American side, roughly 19,000 men were killed. It was and remains one of the costliest battles in American history, and it was won, in the end, not by any single brilliant maneuver, but by the accumulation of 1,000 small, stubborn stands at 1,000 bridges and crossroads and farmhouses, many of them made by men whose names no one would ever learn. Francis Curry's stand was one of those, and it became one of the few that the country did learn, because his company commander, in March of 1945, sat down and recommended the teenager for the Medal of Honor. The reckoning for the massacre came later, and it came in a courtroom. After the war, the United States Army put Paper and dozens of the men of his battle group on trial before a military tribunal at the site of the former Dachau concentration camp, in proceedings that ran through the spring and summer of 1946. Among the 73 defendants were Paper himself and the commander of the entire 6th SS Panzer Army, Sepp Dietrich. On the 16th of July, 1946, the court convicted them, and it sentenced 43 men, Paper among them, to death by hanging. And then, in one of the more troubling episodes of post-war justice, almost none of it held. The convicted men alleged that American interrogators had coerced their confessions through threats, mock trials, and abuse, and a United States Senate inquiry concluded that the pre-trial process had been seriously flawed. Through review after review, the death sentences were commuted, first to life and then to terms of years. In the end, not one of the men condemned for the Malmedy massacre was ever executed. Paper's own sentence was reduced and reduced again, and he was released from prison in 1956, having served only about a dozen years. He went on to work in the German automobile industry and eventually settled in France. In 1976, his home there was attacked and set ablaze in the night, and his body was found in the ashes. The man who had stood at the head of the column that murdered surrendered soldiers died, decades later, in a fire in a quiet French village, a violent and ambiguous end to a violent life. Otto Skorzeny, the architect of the masquerade that sent disguised tanks against Malmedy, faced his own day in court. He was tried in 1947 for the deception at the heart of Operation Greif, for sending his men into battle in the enemy's uniforms, and he was acquitted in part because it was shown that the Allies themselves had used comparable ruses. He lived out his years a free man and something of celebrity in certain circles, dying in his bed in the 1970s. The contrast between the fates of these men and the fate of the boy who beat them at the bridge is not a tidy moral. History rarely offers tidy morals. But it is worth sitting with the fact that the men who built the lie and the men who committed the atrocity mostly escaped the full weight of justice, while the teenager who simply did his duty asked for nothing and received, in the end, exactly the kind of quiet life he seems to have wanted. For Curry, the recommendation moved up the chain and was approved. On the 27th of July, 1945, near the French city of Reims, the commanding general of the 30th Infantry Division, Major General Leland Hobbs, presented the Medal of Honor to the young man his own army had once judged too immature to be made a lieutenant. By then, Curry had risen to the rank of first sergeant, and he had collected, in the course of his war, a chest full of decorations that told the story of a soldier who kept going back into the fire. Alongside the Medal of Honor, a Silver Star for gallantry the following January, a Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts for 3 woundings. He had been a replacement teenager in Holland in the autumn. By the following summer, he was one of the most decorated enlisted men in his division. The institution that had doubted him had been answered, completely and permanently, by a single morning at a bridge. What he did with the rest of his life is, in its quiet way, as revealing as what he did at Malmedy. Francis Curry came home, and he did not trade on his medal or reinvent himself as a professional hero. He went to work for the Veterans Administration, spending his career helping other former soldiers navigate the system that he himself had once entered as an orphan 17-year-old. He worked there for decades and retired in 1980. When people asked him about that morning in Belgium, he tended to deflect, to shrug it off, to insist in one way or another that he had simply done what the situation required, and that there was nothing particularly special about it. It is the most common trait among the men who earned that medal. This insistence that the extraordinary thing they did was really quite ordinary, and Curry carried it to the end of his days. And then, in the late 1990s, his country found a strange and touching way to remember him. The toy company Hasbro, which had been making the G.I. Joe action figure since the 1960s, decided to create a line of figures honoring real Medal of Honor recipients. The very first figure in that series was Francis Curry. They modeled it on him as he'd been at 19, the age he was at Malmedy, and they equipped the 12-inch figure with miniature versions of the exact weapons he had used that day: a tiny rifle, a tiny Browning automatic rifle, a tiny bazooka, and a doll-sized Medal of Honor at its throat. Something like 100,000 of them were produced. Consider the whole arc of that for a moment. A boy who lost both his parents by the age of 12 and grew up a ward of the state. A young man told he was too immature to lead. A teenager who, on a freezing morning, did the work of an entire anti-tank crew with weapons he scavenged off the battlefield and saved 5 lives doing it. And then, half a century later, a child somewhere could hold him in 2 hands, a small plastic soldier with a small plastic bazooka, a hero made literal, a toy. When a reporter asked him about the figure, Curry did not wax poetic about legacy or sacrifice. He said, with the dry modesty that defined him, that his wife thought it was a pretty good likeness. The honors continued, as they tend for the last living witnesses to a vanishing war. He was inducted into the New York State Veterans Hall of Fame. His hometown painted a mural of him. His face appeared, alongside 11 other recipients, on a United States postage stamp commemorating the Medal of Honor of the Second World War. He became, in time, the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the state of New York, and one of only a small handful left alive in the entire country from that war. And on the 8th of October, 2019, Francis Curry died peacefully at his home in Selkirk, New York, at the age of 94. The New York Army National Guard provided his pallbearers. 2 Black Hawk helicopters flew over his grave in salute. The orphan from the Catskills was buried with the full honors of the nation he had served, by men who flew machines he could scarcely have imagined when he was 19 and holding a bridge with a borrowed bazooka. It is worth returning, at the end, to the question the beginning posed, because it turns out to be a question about identity as much as courage. This was a battle drowning in disguise. The enemy came dressed as Americans, in American jeeps and American uniforms, in tanks painted to look like American tank destroyers, in a deliberate, systematic lie about who and what they were. And it was fought a few miles from a field where surrendered Americans had been murdered, with the most basic promise of war, that giving up will spare your life, had been exposed as another kind of lie. In a place where nothing could be trusted to be what it claimed, where surrender meant death, and the enemy wore your own colors, a 19-year-old whom his own army had labeled and dismissed turned out to be precisely what he appeared to be. Not too immature, not a boy in over his head, a soldier. He did not need to be told to surrender to know that he would not. And he answered the disguised armor rolling toward him not with his hands in the air, but with the right weapon, found at the last moment, and the will to cross open ground again and again to use it. Think of where all the players ended. The disguised tanks burned in the field, set alight by the men who built them. The invincible King Tigers were abandoned in the snow and left to become museum pieces. The men who murdered the prisoners cheated the gallows and slipped into long, comfortable afterlives, one of them ending in a fire of his own. And the underestimated orphan went home, helped other veterans for 35 years, became a child's toy, and was carried his grave by an honor guard. The lie burned in the field. The truth rode out on the spare tire of a Jeep, carrying its wounded home, and it lived to be 94. The lie burned in the field. The truth rode out on the spare tire of a Jeep, carrying its wounded home, and it lived to be 94. The orphan from the Catskills, dismissed by his own army as too immature to lead, turned out to be exactly what the situation demanded. On a freezing December morning, surrounded, outgunned, in fighting armor with borrowed weapons, he chose not the arithmetic of surrender, but the harder math of resistance. He crossed open ground under fire again and again, scavenging the right weapon at the right moment, and saved 5 lives in the process. He came home quietly. He helped other veterans navigate the same system he had entered as a fatherless 17-year-old. He deflected praise with the dry modesty that defined him, insisting he had simply done what the situation required. Half a century later, a child could hold him in 2 hands, a small plastic soldier with a small plastic bazooka. He was inducted into halls of fame, honored on a postage stamp, and buried with full military honors at 94, Black Hawk helicopters flying over his grave. In a battle drowning in disguise, where the enemy wore American colors and surrender meant death, the most underestimated man on the field turned out to be precisely what he appeared to be. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.